Hello and good day everyone. Welcome back to my channel and welcome to my little indoor picnic. Niles and I are very happy to have you here. Aren't we, Niles? Today we will be going down the rabbit hole, literally speaking, and explore Alice's adventures in Wonderland. It was written by Lewis Carroll and first published in 1865, so it's quite a lot older than a lot of people might have thought. So why don't you come and join my picnic with some tea and perhaps even a cookie or two, and let's get into it. The story starts on a hot summer day where young Alice and her older sister are sitting by the riverbank. Her sister was reading to Alice, but it was one of those boring books without pictures, so Alice felt quite bored by the activity. Suddenly, Alice sees a white rabbit running past them. Now, there's nothing unusual in this, but what was unusual about this particular rabbit was that he was wearing a waistcoat from which he retrieved a pocket watch, exclaiming, oh dear, I shall be late." So Alice, of course, had no choice but to follow the rabbit as he went down a rabbit hole under a hedge. Once inside the hole, Alice crawled through a tunnel and eventually fell down a ledge. She fell so slowly and for so long that she even managed to doze off before finally reaching the bottom with a gentle thud. There she saw the rabbit again, this time hurrying down a passage, once more exclaiming how late it was getting. There were many doors in this passage, but they were all locked. Eventually, Alice found a golden key on a table, which happened to unlock one of the doors, but alas, the door was tiny, merely 15 inches in height. She could see, however, that there was a beautiful garden on the other side of this door that she really wanted to get to. That is when a bottle appeared on the table with the words "Drink me" printed on the label. But Alice was a wise child and went on to examine the bottle so that it didn't say poison anywhere on it. Reassured by the lack of any poison warnings, Alice proceeded to drink and found that it had a mixed flavor of cherry tart, custard, pineapple, roast turkey, toffee, and hot buttered toast. Yum! And lo and behold, Alice was now only 10 inches tall and would thus fit through the tiny door. The only problem now was that she had placed the key back on the table, which she couldn't reach anymore. Alice scolded herself for this mistake and consequently making herself upset by her own scolding. We learn here that Alice is a curious child who often pretends to be two people. But then she sees a little box under the table with some cake in it, along with a label that says, "Eat me." Don't mind if I do. Alice did as she was told and grew tall again, only she didn't stop growing until she had reached 9 feet. Thus she reproached herself again and began crying quite a lot. That is when the rabbit runs by again, once more muttering about how late he is, and he is so spooked by Alice that he drops some items that he was holding, namely a pair of gloves and a fan. Alice starts fanning herself as the room is very warm, and she has a bit of an existential crisis. But then she discovers that she was shrinking again and had in fact shrunk so small that she could fit through the tiny door again. The problem now was that the door was still locked and the key was still on the table. That wasn't her biggest problem now, though, as she found herself swimming in a pool of her own tears. A mouse swims by, which she starts chatting to, but she can't seem to stop talking about her cat, so the mouse really dislikes her. We don't know what happened to the door, but Alice keeps swimming and eventually reached the shore along with a bunch of animals. Once out of the water, Alice and the animals get into an argument on the best way to get dry. The mouse proceeded to give a history lesson, but that seemed to have little effect. Upon the suggestion of a dodo, they all run around in a circle, which was far more effective. Then Alice can't help herself. She starts talking about her cat again, and all the animals promptly abandon her. But now the white rabbit reappeared, once again in great anxiety, saying that the Duchess will have him executed. He seemed to be looking for something, and Alice concluded that it must be the gloves and fan that he had dropped earlier. The rabbit sees her, calls her Marianne, and angrily orders her to run home and fetch a pair of gloves and a fan. Alice did as she was told and soon found a little house. So she went inside and quickly retrieved another pair of gloves and a fan. I feel like I've said pair of gloves and a fan many times today. But then she sees a bottle. This time it had no label saying "drink me," but Alice did so nonetheless as she wanted to see what would happen. This was a decision she soon had to regret, for she began to grow again, and she continued growing. And before she knew it, she was too large to fit in the room, and had to take one of her arms out of the window and her foot into the chimney. Once again, Alice has another existential crisis, and I don't actually blame her. So the rabbit finds her, or rather her now gigantic arm sticking out of one of his windows, and freaks out completely. He goes on to fetch some other animals to help him with this issue, and they send a lizard named Bill down the chimney. But Alice kicks poor Bill back up the chimney, and he's now very shaken up and is given some brandy by the other animals. They then go on to throw some pebbles at Alice through the window, for some reason, and Alice noticed that the pebbles turned into little cakes. She ate one in the hopes of shrinking, and sure enough, she did. She was now quite a lot smaller than her normal size and went on to flee the house as well as the horde of angry animals. So she runs into a forest where she soon encounters a playful puppy. To her, however, the puppy was the size of an elephant. Alice then goes on to play fetch with the puppy until she can sneak away. She realizes that she has to grow to her normal size again, but how? She needed to drink or eat something for that. This is when she finds a large mushroom, and not only that, it had a caterpillar sitting on top of it, smoking a hookah. 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 It's such a funny word, isn't it? Hookah. "Who are you?" the caterpillar asked. Not a good question for Alice, who, at present, was very confused in this regard. They have a bit of back and forth, where Alice complains about changing in size so much that day, until eventually the caterpillar gets tired of her and leaves. But just as he walks away, he tells her that one side will make you grow taller and the other side will make you grow shorter. He was referring to the mushroom he had been sitting on. So Alice breaks off a piece from each side and tries them out. Unfortunately, the mushroom was very potent, and Alice ended up far above the treetops with an unnaturally long, bendable neck. A bird flies into her face and accuses her of being a serpent, which is quite justified, to be honest. So Alice goes on to nibble each mushroom piece just enough to bring herself back to a normal size, and then continues walking along in the forest. Then she comes across a tiny little house and decides to shrink herself again so she doesn't frighten whoever lives there. It turns out to be the house of the famous Duchess, the one that the rabbit had been so anxious about being late to. And she was quite a peculiar character. Alice witnessed her having some violent argument with her cook, who kept throwing things at her while she was holding a screaming baby. Then the Duchess says that she's off to go and play croquet with the Queen, and gives her baby to Alice to nurse in the meantime. Alice decided to save the baby from this clearly dangerous home and starts walking away with it. But then it turns into a pig. So she puts the pig down and it scurries off into the forest. No questions asked there. That's when the Duchess's cat appears sitting in a tree. Alice asks the cat which way to go, and after some cryptic back and forth, there's a lot of that in this story, she gets the option to go either to the Mad Hatters or to the March Hare, although they are both, in fact, mad. They are all mad there. So Alice makes the choice to go to the March Hare. Although before she does that, she would like to remind you to like the video if you're enjoying it. Soon enough, Alice finds the house and there is a large table set in front of it. Alice joined the March Hare, Mad Hatter and the mouse that was sitting there, and the Mad Hatter asks her, "Why is a raven like a writing desk?" And Alice, thinking that she's been asked a riddle, tries to guess it. She doesn't get the chance to, however, as the conversation keeps changing with every second. But the short version is this. Unless I've misunderstood it, which is highly likely. The Mad Hatter used to be friends with Time. Yes, Time. But then the Queen executed Time, and now they are all stuck at 6 o'clock, which is why the table is always set for tea. Are we all good on this? Keeping up? Good. Let's continue. So then the mouse starts telling a story, but Alice keeps interrupting it with questions. At least she stopped talking about her cat. Overall, the people at the tea party were quite rude to Alice, so she decided to leave, and she marches back out into the forest where she comes across a door on one of the trees. Thinking this to be rather curious, she enters through the door and finds herself back in the corridor. But Alice had leveled up now in terms of the illogical rules of this universe, so she walked right up to the table with the key, takes the key, and then eats a piece of mushroom to shrink to the appropriate size for the tiny door. And then she went through and had finally arrived in the beautiful garden. As she's walking along, Alice sees 3 gardeners, although they're not human gardeners, they're actually playing cards. And they're painting some white roses red, and they're quite anxious while doing it too. Almost immediately, the Queen's procession arrives. The Queen, King, and Knave, I believe, are the only human-like figures, and their 10 children, as well as all the soldiers, are playing cards. The Queen stops as she sees Alice and asks, "Who are you?" And Alice replies quite assertively that she's Alice. Then the Queen asks who the gardeners are, and Alice replies rather curtly that she didn't know. That's no business of hers. "Off with her head," says the Queen, as she doesn't like it when people are being rude to her, but her king persuades her against it, reminding her that Alice is only a child. So instead, the Queen invites Alice to play croquet with them. That turned out to be quite difficult though, as in this type of croquet you had hedgehogs for balls and live flamingos for mallets. As Alice is struggling getting her flamingo to cooperate, the Cheshire Cat appears again, or at least the head of the cat, and she starts talking to it. Then the king comes up to her and she introduces him to the cat. The king says that the cat may kiss his hand if it likes, but the cat replied that it did not. So the king was very offended and called for the queen, who immediately sentenced the cat to a beheading, but this caused a bit of a debate, for how do you behead a creature that is just a floating head? So the Duchess is brought out from prison, where she was awaiting execution, as Alice said that the cat belonged to her, but the Queen is so angry when she sees her that she dismisses her immediately, and then the croquet game is resumed. The Queen is very agitated though, and has nearly all the players arrested and sentenced to death, So they are all taken into custody, and eventually there was only the Queen, King, and Alice left playing. The Queen then asks if Alice has met the Mock Turtle, which she had not, and the Queen thought this had to be rectified at once. So she takes Alice with her and leads her to a Gryphon, whom she orders to take Alice to the Mock Turtle. So he does, and Alice is then forced to listen to the Mock Turtle telling his life story, and he cries a lot while doing that, although it's not entirely clear why. Alice stays with them for a while and they're having a bit of a chit-chat. Trust me, it's not worth repeating. I quite struggled making sense of it, and in the end I did not succeed. In the end, the Gryphon takes Alice's hand and rushes off with her as the trial is about to start. Arriving at the trial, we find the Queen and her King, as well as plenty of animals and the whole deck of cards. The King was the judge and 12 animals made up the jury. The accused was the knave, and he was in chains next to a couple of playing card soldiers. The King then signals for the herald to start the trial, and the herald is our dear little white rabbit, of course, and he blows his trumpet and says, "The Queen of Hearts, she made some tarts all on a summer day. The Knave of Hearts, he stole those tarts and took them quite away." In other words, he stands accused of stealing baked goods from the Queen. So the first witness is called, and that is the Mad Hatter. The King asks him to remove his hat, but the Hatter replies that it isn't his hat. "Stolen!" the King cried, but the Hatter explained, "I keep them to sell. I have none of my own. I'm a hatter." I thought that was quite funny. But well, the Hatter doesn't have anything to say. In fact, he is far too nervous to say much at all, so he's dismissed. The next witness, who happened to be the Duchess's cook, actually managed to sneak away during some commotion in the courtroom, so then the third witness is called, which happened to be Alice herself. So Alice comes forth, although she's quite big now, as she had started growing again all of a sudden. So the King asks her what she knows, and she replies, "Nothing whatsoever." Then they go on to complain about her increasing height and asks her to leave the courtroom, but she refuses. Everything turns into a bit of a mess. Not that it was in good order before, but still. Alice was having none of the nonsense now that she was much bigger than everyone else. So when the Queen wanted to do sentence before the verdict, Alice called out how nonsensical this was. The Queen turned purple, telling her to hold her tongue, but Alice refused. "Off with her head!" shouted the Queen once more, but nobody moved. Alice wasn't afraid of them, and she told them so. "You're all just a deck of cards." All of a sudden, the cards went up in the air and began swirling around her, and that's when Alice woke up, realizing that she was laying down with her head in her sister's lap. Her sister says that she's been sleeping for quite some time and that it's time to get home for tea. So Alice walks home, thinking that it had been a wild dream, but concluded somehow that it had also been a good dream. The end. So, a little bit of backstory here is that Lewis Carroll's real name was actually, hold on, let me get this, Charles Lutwidge Dodgson. No, Charles Lutwidge Dodgson. Charles Lutwidge Dodgson. It's impossible to say. Charles Lutwidge Dodgson. That's a tongue twister. And he lived between 1832 and 1898. He was actually a mathematician at the University of Oxford, which isn't the most typical profession for fantasy fiction authors. Not that Alice could be described as fantasy in a traditional sense, but given the contents, I'm inclined to categorize it that way. Aside from being a mathematician, he was also a writer, as we know, a poet, photographer, and hobby inventor. And yeah, Lewis Carroll was good friends with the dean of the college, as well as his family, and would often babysit their children, one of whom was named Alice. One day in the summer of 1862, he had taken her out rowing, and there he made up the outline of what would later become Alice's adventures in Wonderland. Little Alice loved it so much and begged him to write it down, which he eventually did, and he even made an illustrated manuscript by hand that he ended up giving her. And despite Alice sharing her name with the protagonist of the story, Lewis Carroll always denied that the girl in the story was based on her. Now, there are speculations that his attentions towards Alice may not have been entirely innocent, but as far as I know, there exists no proof of that. I just wanted to mention this in case anyone would think that I wasn't aware of it. But yeah, I just wanted to highlight how different Lewis Carroll seems to have been compared to many of his peers. He had so many passions that he wasn't afraid of pursuing, and yet he was also very much of an introvert. He really was a brilliant mind and artist all in one, and I find that really inspiring. So there's this theme throughout the whole book about identity. Alice gets asked who she is many times, both by the creatures she encounters as well as by Alice herself. And throughout most of the story, this is a difficult question for her, and she can go on a long tangent about not knowing who she is. Not because she doesn't remember, but because of all of the confusion and crazy things happening to her in Wonderland. That is what makes her doubt her own identity. It's kind of like the two don't exist on the same plane, on the same level. Alice tries to navigate through Wonderland using the logic of the real world, but that's not how Wonderland works. Wonderland will give you the tools, but it's only experience that will teach you how to use them. Now, let's take the corridor with the tiny door as an example. Alice ends up in this corridor both in the beginning of the story as well as near the end. The first time, however, it didn't go very well for her. She found the tiny door, and through it she saw a beautiful garden that she wanted to explore, but she couldn't fit through the door. So on the table close by were a key and a bottle with the drink me label. She drinks the whole bottle, shrinks, but forgot the key on the table, and now she's too small to reach it. Wonderland then gave her a cake to make her grow, but by eating it she grew far too tall for the door and was out of the shrink drink. So she failed in her task to get through the door and goes on to have lots of other adventures in Wonderland before ending up in that corridor again near the end. But now Alice had learned a thing or two. Using the mushroom pieces in her pockets, she gets the key and then shrinks herself just enough to fit through the door. That was her level up moment. She had finally learned the rules of Wonderland and how to use them to her advantage. This is also when her confidence in herself and her identity is restored. So in the garden, when the queen asks her who she is, she knows exactly what the reply is. I couldn't help but think that this was really allegorical to real life, which I really did not expect going into this. That when there is so much confusion in the world around you, you begin to question your own identity in a way, or just struggle with self-acceptance, especially growing up, as well as when you're faced with the responsibilities of adulthood for the first time. But then, once you've learned from your mistakes and you know how everything works, your identity and place in the world becomes more clear. This is also why I chose to talk a little bit about Lewis Carroll after the summary. It wouldn't surprise me if he himself struggled with finding his place in society. There are just so many ways in which you can interpret the chaos of Wonderland, and for me personally, I really think it carries some important messages about growing up and figuring out how the world works. And am I the only one who feels that Alice's adventures in Wonderland has an ominous feel to it? Almost dark and eerie in a way. I remember watching the Disney movie as a child and I found it terrifying. I would never want to set foot in Wonderland. It could just be me. Even as a child, I had a very low tolerance for nonsense. Do let me know if you guys felt similar about the movie, if you saw it growing up as well. I am curious to know. If you're still here, I just wanted to say thank you. It was lovely of you to come and join my little picnic. Do share your thoughts and feelings in the comments below and like the video if you haven't already. If you're interested in another children's book I've covered on the channel, I recommend checking out The Secret Garden. I'll leave a link to that in the description. With all of that being said, thank you so much for watching today and we hope to see you back next time. Bye!